Thanks very much to all of you for allowing us to film Erik, and also for Erik to come here. He's a great friend of the museum, and it's always a pleasure to have him here. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Tony, for the introduction, and I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate that the Institute invited me. And I have a lot of friends in Savannah, really based on the book. I didn't know anybody here. In fact, I don't think I'd ever even been here before doing the book. And I was desperate, and some people sensed that, so they helped me out. We've become friends. Also, I'm really glad to be speaking to some teachers from Florida, because although we live in Charleston now, we have sand in our shoes and salt water in our blood. We lived in Miami for 6 years, and I was with Newsweek. And then we came up and we were living in Orlando in Winter Park, and we've got a house at New Smyrna Beach, so we've got strong roots in Florida. And at least I know that the heat here is not foreign to me. Although I think the humidity may be even worse here, I'm not sure. But in any case, they asked me to talk about how I came up with the idea for The Wanderer, and how I then turned it into a book. And it was my first book of this kind. And it's a genre that's really very interesting. It's, narrative nonfiction. And I just came back from Texas. There's a big convention there that happens every July called the Mayborn Narrative Nonfiction, or Literary Nonfiction Conference. I'm not sure what it is, but it's got some of the great writers every summer that go out there. And it's limited to 600 people, and it's just a fascinating way to meet people who have taken history and then turned it into this narrative nonfiction. And they also address some of the issues as well, because, one of the, as I'll explain to you with The Wanderer, one of the issues is how much literary license can you use in taking facts and then trying to make it into a story. And that really bedeviled me when I was writing this book. I wasn't even aware that it was an issue, but in my own head I was trying to figure out just, how do you do this? But in any case, I'll start the story really where it began for me, which was on Jekyll Island. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jekyll Island, but it's about, I think, 40 or 50 miles south of here. And Jekyll is off the coast of Georgia. It's a barrier island, and it's about 2 miles wide and about 7 miles long. And in the 1890s, if you were wondering where all the wealthiest of the wealthy people in America were in the dead of winter, they were on Jekyll Island. And these are people like the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Pulitzers. All of these people, they bought the entire island, Jekyll Island, and starting in I think the 1880s, 1890s, they began to build cottages there, and they were cottages in the sort of grandeur as Newport, Rhode Island, not 1,500 square feet, but 15,000 square feet, And then as more and more of them came down, they decided to build this grand hotel right in the middle, and a 3-story hotel. And this was for their friends, and a turret and a pennant, flying up above. So this was their playland for quite a while. And but by the 1930s, with the Depression and just changing tastes, Jekyll Island as a place for the wealthiest people really sort of ended, and the houses began to fall into disrepair. In the 1950s, the state of Georgia bought the whole island and began restoring the houses. And so for any of you who have been there today, the houses are beautiful. You can go visit them. They're fascinating. The hotel is wonderful. And beyond that, the whole island has prospered, and there are golf courses and tennis courts and other hotels and even a water slide park, which my son enjoyed when he was out there. So, in any case, this was about 10 years ago. I brought my family up there for a week, and we stayed at the hotel, enjoyed all the amenities. And then one day we went over and we looked at the museum, which is right in the middle there. They made it out of the old carriage house. And so you walk in and you see pictures of all of the happy millionaires smiling and in their white linen suits, and you see their wives with the big floppy hats and their kids, riding little ponies and on little carts and wearing their knickers and soft caps and all. And you see the gilt china that they used, in the dining room, and the silver and the crystal and all of that. So you get a good flavor for this great lifestyle. And then as you go on there, you learn other things about Jekyll, like that in 1913 the Federal Reserve was founded on Jekyll Island, and that's because the wealthiest men in America were there, and they got together and tried to figure out how to handle the money supply. And in fact, they said that, I think at one point they said that in the wintertime, 2/3 of the personal wealth of America was right on that island, that one island. It's pretty amazing. And you also learn that the first transcontinental telephone call was made through Jekyll Island. And that's because the president of AT&T, Thomas Vail, was vacationing there, and he refused to leave. So they had to run a telephone line from New York all the way down to Jekyll Island and then out to the West Coast so that he could talk to Alexander Graham Bell in New York and Thomas Watts in San Francisco. So anyhow, you're going through and you're learning all this stuff, and then as we were just about to leave and you could see the exit sign, there was a little alcove, and I turned and looked in that alcove, and there was this photograph of a painting of a sailing ship, and that picture, by the way, is on the cover of the book. But there was a caption under the photograph, and it said, "In 1858, 50 years after the importation of slaves was prohibited by Congress, the Wanderer delivered a cargo of African slaves to the coast of Jekyll Island. This action caused a scandal, and charges were brought against many people, including the ship's crew and its owner, Charles Lamar of Savannah. All of the defendants were found innocent, or charges against them were dropped." So, I read that, and I thought, gee, and I literally walked away from it, and I got about 5 steps, and I said, wait a minute, I got to look at that again. I turned around and looked at this thing. And I thought, this is really odd. I mean, here you have this sinister event happening on this sort of island of recreation and fun. It'd be like a slave ship landing at Disney World. And it just seemed so incongruous. And the other thing that surprised me was that it happened in 1858, and I didn't know much about slavery or Civil War history or any of that, but I did dimly recall that, in the early 1800s, and it was 1808, the slave trade had been banned. The African slave trade had been banned. So what's the ship doing on Jekyll Island in 1858? It didn't make any sense. And so I was sort of puzzled by it. I didn't get any answers. And so when I got back home, I did a little research, and I found a speech that had been written in the 1870s by somebody connected to this whole event. And he said, well, this wasn't just a commercial venture, people trying to bring in some slaves to sell them and make some money. It was really a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy to jumpstart the Civil War by people who thought the Civil War was going to happen unless they did something dramatic to make the North and South really come apart. And this conspiracy was perpetuated by, or was committed by, some Northerners and Southerners. So that's a pretty heavy, an interesting tale. But I decided I didn't want to get into it because I didn't know anything about slavery, and I didn't know anything really about the Civil War. And beyond that, I really didn't want to write a book, although I was looking for a book idea. I didn't want to write on something that was so depressing. I didn't want to spend 2 years, in this thing. And so I put it away. And then about 2 years later, I was reading that book by Laura Hillenbrand. It's called Seabiscuit, which I'm sure you've all read. And what was interesting was that in the foreword to that book, she said in 1938, and that's when her story took place, the biggest news story in America wasn't FDR or Hitler or Clark Gable, or Howard Hughes. It was this spindly little racehorse called Seabiscuit. And I thought, geez, I wonder about the Wanderer. And so I literally swiveled around in my chair and got on the internet and got to the New York Times archives, and I typed in the Wanderer 1858 to 1860, and I pressed the button, and to my amazement, 140 hits came up, and 140 publications. And they weren't insignificant. It was the front page of the New York Times, front page of the Boston papers, Washington papers, even London. And so I suddenly realized, gee, you know, I've got this situation of the ship landing, you know, the sinister event happening on this vacation island, and it happened in 1858, right before the Civil War, you know, and it wasn't a commercial venture, it was a conspiracy, and it was a piece of history that had at one time been huge and had been forgotten about. And that's hard to ignore, you know, and whether I want to do this or not, I think somebody's telling me to go do this story, you know. So I put together a proposal, and I had an agent because I'd done some other books, some collaborations, and he got it out to publishers, and you know, one of them said, well, this is just a footnote to history, you can't write a book about this, you know. And another one said, you know, this is such a dark episode in history, and she'd seen authors get into these kind of things and never come out the other end. You know, but fortunately, there was one guy, an editor named Michael Flamini at St. Martin's Press, who loved this kind of thing. You know, he loved history with a strong narrative heartbeat, and that's what this was. So I got a book contract to go write the book. Then now I had to go write the thing. You know, I used to work at the Wall Street Journal, and one thing I learned at the Journal is that if you're going to start on a story, the first thing you got to do is find everything that's been written about it by anybody else or any materials that you can find. And then once you get all of that, then you can build out from there. So I was very fortunate. There was a book that had been written by a fellow named Tom Wells, and it was written in the 60s, and he was getting his master's degree at the U.S. Naval Academy. And he wrote a very interesting book about the Wanderer that was sort of focused on maritime issues. But it was really well done, and the good thing about it as well is that since he was an academic, it had been very well footnoted. So I had sort of a place to start. And I began to realize also that a lot of the materials I was going to have to use were up at the Library of Congress in Washington. I'd never been to the Library of Congress, but it sounded, you know, very... it sounded like a labyrinth that I could get into for the rest of my life and never find my way to the water fountain, you know. And I realized that I needed to find somebody who could help me. And fortunately, the Library of Congress offers a list, about a 15-page list of researchers that you can hire who spent their entire lives there. And, you know, despite the fact that it was expensive, you know, I did have an advance, and I realized I needed to find somebody. And so it was just a lucky sort of pointing my finger at a name and calling, and I found this woman named Cecile K. Richter. And she'd been doing this for 20 or 30 years, knew everything about it. So we started working together, and I started, you know, emailing her lists of the stuff I needed to get. But the great thing was that Cecile was a real bloodhound, and so whenever I would mention something that I needed, she would not only get that, copy it, but she would dig even deeper. And oftentimes the stuff she brought up, you know, at great expense to me, unfortunately, was you know, was nothing I needed. But a lot of it was very important stuff. And I'll just give you an example. I was just looking at the. This is the kind of stuff she would bring up. I mean, I didn't even know things like this existed. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Earl of Malmesbury, to Lord Lyons, May 6, 1859, number 263, Class B, Correspondence with Foreign Ministers in England relating to the Slave Trade, Volume 45, RG 45, M89. I don't know how she found it or what it meant, but apparently a lot of people kept records, and you know, it just blew my mind that the captains of British ships sailing off the coast of Africa would be writing long letters to, you know, their bosses in London, and all this stuff was still existed. You could actually read what they saw and what they said to one another. So Cecile was great, and the UPS man would arrive daily with enormous boxes, and it was really, when I got to the point of sheer exhaustion, almost blind, I thought I would find, you know, I was finally through with the boxes, and he would be coming with more of these things. I also found out that the federal records that I thought would be in Savannah about the trial didn't exist. There was not a trace of anything here. And I surmised that what happened was that as Sherman approached, the Lamar family and probably everybody else in town made sure that anything that might incriminate them in any way was disposed of, so it was gone. But I did find federal records in the National Archives in Atlanta for the Southern region. And so once again, I hired somebody there who had worked there. And in Cecile's case, we worked together for weeks and months. In Atlanta, I think I hired somebody for about 5 days to find specific stuff. And then I came up here to Savannah and did a lot of work at the Georgia Historical Society Library. Have you visited that yet? You know, it's a great building, and you know, it's got that oval kind of downstairs and then a gallery upstairs. And I didn't really know what I was looking for. I mean, there was nothing I was looking for that said the Wanderer story, volumes 1 through 4. I mean, you know, it was everywhere. And particularly trying to understand the flavor of what was going on, what the life was like, there was no one place for it. And so I literally started at one end of that library, and you know, my head ended up sideways at the end of the day. Would go through that whole, I went through that entire library, and then went upstairs. It took me weeks and went through the whole thing. And I found stuff all over the place that I thought I could use, and then I'd have to have it copied, you know. And then, for instance, there were a lot of periodicals too. So there was the Georgia Historical Quarterly, which had been coming out quarterly since 1917. That's 384 issues, and some of them were thick. And I went through every one of those things, you know, to see if I could find things. So this was really looking for, you know, straws and splinters. And then, of course, there were things in their archives. And the ladies there, I think they're a different bunch of ladies there now, but they were very strict. They were the archive Nazis, you know. And you'd have to come in there. You'd have to take any personal possessions you had and put it in a locker, you know, pens, anything. And, you know, it was, if they had a body scanner, I think they would have used it. And then they give you a soft pencil, and then, you know, you have to put on white gloves, you know. But the worst part was then you sit there and they're sort of looking over you, you know, like, I was paranoid the entire time I would do that stuff. But then you'd find the things you wanted and they would make copies. So it was pulling together a tremendous amount of information to get this together. Let me see here. So in any case, I pulled all this stuff together. I had it in my office, and you know, I would get up at 3 o'clock every morning and do this because I still had a full-time job that I needed to do on top of it. And I got very familiar with the people at 7-Eleven, and because they were the only people open then. It was usually a drunk, a cop, and me. You know? And the other thing too that I found was newspaper. The newspaper, fortunately in Georgia, they had something called the Georgia Newspaper Project, and they are microfilming or have microfilmed all the newspapers, which is just fabulous. And better than that, you could buy the rolls per year, $35 a roll. So that meant that I didn't have to go to a library to look at this stuff. And fortunately, Rollins College, which was just down the street from us, their library is great, and they have a beautiful, you know, viewer for microfilm. But probably the best thing that happened to me in the entire book was that, you know, when you use microfilm, you got to put a dime in there or whatever, and then it makes all this grinding noise, and then you get this yellow copy. And I had to read so much of this stuff. There, they had this beautiful copier, and it was set up to a laser printer. So you could press the button, and it would just go like that, and you'd have a copy. And I said, well, how much is it per copy? And they looked at me and they said, it's free. I couldn't believe it. So I was really happy, because I had to make so many copies of this stuff. I even went out, I felt so guilty, I started bringing in my own paper, and I bought my own drum for it. You know, it was like $220 because I really ran through the entire ink. And I read so much of that microfilm that at the end of the day, I thought I had gone blind because I just couldn't, you know, I'd look out, everything looked white like a sheet. But in any case, I got all this material together, and I thought, okay, now I've got to write this thing. And I thought, this is going to be fun. It's going to be leisurely. It'll take a few years. I'll come up to Savannah a lot, and I'll have drink mint juleps, you know, and enjoy this experience. Two things happened that screwed that whole plan up. And one was that I got my agent to promise not to tell anybody what the story was about, because I felt like, you know, this is a hot thing, you know, and I didn't want anybody to know about it. So he agreed. And then one day I got a call from a friend. He said, hey, that's great about that book, The Wanderer. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, well, it's in Publishers Weekly, The Wanderer. Yeah, the last American slave ship. So it not only mentioned the name of the thing, but it blew the whole, you know, the whole story. So that was very disconcerting. But the worst part was that I was up at the Georgia Historical Society going through some stuff, and I was just about to leave, and I look on one of the research desks, and there are these two big black very professional looking binders. And, you know, they have like a little labeling part on the side, and it says, The Wanderer, 1858 to 1859, 1859. And I thought, oh, this is really bad. I said worse than that, but since you're school teachers, I don't. I thought somebody is onto this book, and they're researching it. And I'm screwed, because if they come out, this person may be a fast writer, a great writer. If they get this out first, that's the end of my book. So I was really panicked, and I remember calling my wife and just saying, you're not going to see me for a few months because I've got to write this thing. Yeah. So in any case, I went back to Winter Park, where we were living, and I had an office in sort of near the railroad tracks, if you're familiar with that area. And I took all this stuff and I put it into 10 piles that sort of corresponded to what I thought would be 10 chapters. And then I came in one day and I said, I'm going to start writing. And if you notice that, I think the first chapter says, it was a sunny day in Savannah and Lamar. The one thing I can tell, the rest of the book is true. I don't know if it was a sunny day, but I knew I had to start somewhere, and I was going to start with a sunny day. And that's what I did. And then I just started writing like a madman. However, and the good thing about writing history is that it can be chronological, you know, which means that saves you a lot in terms of organization, you know. And I had actually put a chart up on the wall, so it was, you know, month to month, week to week, even day to day, what was happening. And I even had a cast of characters, because there were so many people involved in all of this stuff that I was getting them mixed up. And if you looked at the older newspapers, you know, oftentimes the dates were not quite right and the spellings were all over the place. So I was trying to keep it straight. But as I started writing the book, I realized that this wasn't a book about a ship that was built, you know, on Long Island and then came down to Charleston, sailed to, you know, Africa, came back to Jekyll Island, and then there was a trial, and that's it. I mean, that was the bare bones of it. It was really the context of why this happened that was important. And so I realized that I couldn't start it with The Wanderer. I had to go back 20 years, and I started it in 1838 with Charles Lamar's father. And in 1838, I could explain that the South was optimistic. You know, things were going well, and it was emerging from this Jeffersonian agricultural age, and suddenly, you know, there was steam power, which was like, you know, the electricity of a later age, or computers, and this was the new world. And Gosaway Lamar, Charles Lamar's father, was the wealthiest businessman in the South, And he decided South was going to equal the North, and maybe even better the North in technology. And so he did a number of things. But so that was sort of the idea of chapter 1. And chapter 2 was the Pulaski, and this was really the manifestation of all of his dreams of progress, that he would build this ship. And when you go inside there, you'll see a big model of it. And I just thought the Pulaski had really Shakespearean overtones. That here's this guy, pride, building this huge thing, putting his entire family on it, and then it explodes, and most of his family is lost. But in a bigger way, the message really was that the South was failing to keep up technologically with the North. So then the third chapter is now moving the chronology up to 1858, and here is the son of Gosaway, and frustrated by what he sees and what is really truthfully, the economic dominance of the North, and the huge success of the North, and really the servile position that the South is in really almost every way, and this frustration. And I got to that point, and then I realized, okay, I have to stop this chronology, and I got to explain to people what's going on, and so I stopped, and on chapter 4, I think it was, I talked about the fire eaters, and the fire eaters were this group, of really misfits who were extremely intelligent, extremely well read, and very good, incredible speakers and writers. Adolf Hitler, the analogy between what was going on, then and Germany in the 1930s is just incredible. Because if you have the brown shirts, you have this group of people who were not, who were misfits. Nobody took them seriously, and within 8 years they took over Germany, and they sent the world into war. It was the exact same thing with the fire eaters. So I had to explain that, and then I continued on with the chronology. But there were a number of places where, as I was writing the chronology, I realized I started having to write an aside to try to explain to the reader what was going on. And pretty soon, that aside, I realized, had to become a chapter on its own. And when I did that meant I had to go back and find the books and research things, and I didn't know anything, So I was on the internet quite a bit looking for books, and through Abe's books and other places, I found some great books that were written towards the end of the 1890s, the early 1900s. And what you really find in a lot of that stuff is how history changes, how the spin changes, and particularly about the Civil War. The spin we got right now, if you go back to the early 1900s or the 1890s, is entirely different. And because it's politically incorrect right now to say some of the things that they said then. I don't know what was right. I won't say what was right and what was wrong, but they're certainly fabrication. You look at history, and that was. But in any case, so I had to do these asides, and one of them, for instance, was the Africa squadron off the coast of Africa. Supposedly, African slave trading was against the law in England and in the United States. The United States had naval vessels patrolling the coast, and so did Britain. But it didn't work, and it was really, I think, analogous to some of the war against drugs that we have now. It's, where the war is, I'm not quite sure, but it doesn't seem to be doing much. But in that case, they were supposed to block vessels from getting into Africa and leaving. But what was so incredible was that they spent more time, the Americans, the British, irritating one another, because the War of 1812 was fought to a certain extent, or maybe to a great extent, over the fact that the British, were sidling up to American ships and demanding papers, and then pulling American sailors off those ships. There was still a lot of anger between the British and the Americans about that. So rather than working together to stop the slave trade, they were far more interested in just in reporting each other. He did this. Oh, he shouldn't have done that. And that's what all those letters were going back and forth. He disgraced my honor. And all of that. Beyond that, and one of the big overtones too, is that neither, particularly the United States, didn't care if the slave trade was really blocked or not, because there was a huge amount of money being made. And the slaves weren't going to the United States at this time, but they were going to Cuba. But that's another story. In any case, there were a lot of things, and I'll say one other thing too, because I'm talking to history teachers. You know, when you read a lot of histories over a period of time, you really have to figure out, you have to make your own statement. And when things are inconsistent, you know, how do you decide what is right? You know, because they just, you know, their whole points of view are just not meshing. And I thought in my case, and this is an aside, that when I would finish my manuscript, that the publisher, being St. Martin's Press, one of the best, you know, publishers, would then farm that out to different academics and all these people, and they would comment on it, and I would get it back, and then I would adjust things and apologize, and then it would be published. You know, they said, "Oh, this is great," and then they published the thing. You know. And I tell you, I was really nervous, you know, because I was saying a lot of things based on, you know, sort of my half-assed interpretation. I didn't know if it was right. But I have to say one of the most gratifying things that did happen was that when it came out as in paperback, I had the opportunity to send, or before it came out in paperback, I had the opportunity to send the hardback to a lot of really top scholars, really, really top scholars. I just was blown away. They came back and said, "This is great," and nobody found a mistake in it. Now, I did have a couple reviews, or one review actually from an academic who didn't like it for a number of reasons and did find some errors in it. But you know, I mean, hopefully there'll be a new edition in it, and I'm very grateful for somebody finding those errors, and I'll fix them. But anyhow, I did find one of the odd parts about this thing was trying to put all of this in sync. In any case, I wrote this thing, and I wrote it basically because I've been with the Wall Street Journal. I wrote it in the style of the Wall Street Journal, and with the ethics of the Wall Street Journal and the ethics of the journal. At least it used to be this way, and I hope it still is that what you wrote had to be correct, you know. And if it wasn't, you were really in a lot of trouble, because when I was there, the circulation of the paper was, I think, about 2 million, and the readership was about 6 million. And I wrote a lot of front-page stories, and I can't tell you that the night before a front-page story would come out, I'd shake in bed. Part, you know, eager anticipation, part 5 million people are going to read this thing. That's a lot of eyes finding errors, and you know, you having to turn out these stories under a lot of pressure, but it still had to be right. And so the first time I wrote the Wanderer, I just kept to the tenet of the Wall Street Journal, where I didn't say anything unless I was absolutely sure. Now, of course, you're working on newspaper reports, you're working on letters, and so unfortunately, I guess all history is based on possible errors, but at least you're footnoting your possible errors, blaming it on other people, you know. But there were a couple parts in writing it where the history had disappeared, and this is another, you know, interesting thing about writing this narrative nonfiction. That, you know, you see the stepstones, and then all of a sudden there's 9 feet of brush, and you don't see the stepping stones, and then you see it pick up on the other side there. Well, you can either say, I don't know what went on there in those 9 feet of bushes, so I'm going to just go do something else, you know? Or you can somehow try to get that, to fix that. And I found that to be one of the most interesting parts of writing, in that what you would have to do is you'd have to get surrounding evidence, you know, and try to figure out just what happened in those bushes. And so, for instance, suppose it's the 1920s and you had a couple of characters and they went to see a baseball game. You know, well, you wouldn't, but there was no knowledge of what happened when they were in that baseball game. But you can sort of figure out by researching what a baseball game was in the 1920s, you know, to try to set the scene. And then people may have said afterwards what was said at that baseball game. And I had a very similar situation. a very good example is the building of the Wanderer. You know, there were no records of the Wanderer actually being built. But I found the schematics, you know, so I had all the blueprints. I found a map of where the boatyard was, where the ship was built, where the keel was laid. And I literally flew up to LaGuardia Airport and rented a car and went out to East Setauket with this map in my lap. It was like and I put a big X on it, you know, it was like a treasure map, you know. And it was a pretty cool feeling, you know, that I drove down there and that was the spot, you know. And so I went out there and I stood there and I tried to imagine what it was like when that ship was done. But in terms of building the ship, I had, you know, I had to go back and I had to get old books that showed how a wooden ship in 1858 was built. And that's what I use. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because I think that's how you have to somehow tell a story. But you have to be, you know, true and ethical. In any case, I finished this draft of the book. It was all written to the Wall Street Journal, except for a few places where I had to put in some creativity. And I got back from my editor this note. They said they really liked it. But there were a couple places they thought it was really great. And I said, oh, where are those? And it was where I used some creativity. And I said, oh. And I said, well, and I explained to him that those were places where I had to just use different, you know, circumstantial evidence to try to build this. And I never, he said, that's God's gift to you, use it. I thought, wow, that sounds pretty good, you know. So I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, use some more creativity in this. And I said, well, how far can I go? And he said, go as far as you need to go, and if you've gone too far, we'll pull you back. I don't think they would have, but judging from publishers today, you know, if they could sell books. But anyhow, so I went back and I started looking at it slightly differently, and I still didn't change it much from what I had written originally in terms of the ethics, because I was really, you know, it was pounded into my head that you had to have everything proven. But I'll give you a good example. In the trial at the end of the book, towards the end of the book, you know, I knew exactly what was said in that trial. And I knew it because two newspapers covered the whole trial every day that the trial continued. And shorthand had just been invented a few years earlier. It was really incredible. And so they could write this stuff down, and as it was spoken. There was some inconsistency between the papers, but I could generally get it right. So in the book, you know, the lawyer could ask a question, the witness could reply, but I couldn't get them to do anything. I couldn't get the lawyer to stand up and walk around the desk and point a finger at the guy, you know, because I didn't have any evidence. Well, it was a little bit of that literary license that I was able to do, that I was able to get somebody to stand up, to walk across the room. And also in the interim, I found I thought that the trial had taken place in the federal courthouse. And I was in the library trying to find the federal courthouse. And finally, to my dismay, I found out that it had been knocked down in 1954. And I thought, rats, you know, because what I wanted to do, just like I went and experienced the laying of the keel of the Wanderer in East Setauket, I wanted to be in that courtroom and imagine it happening, look at the light coming through the windows, count how many steps there were to the door. I couldn't do it. And then one day, I was walking along East Bay, and I walked by the customs house. And there's this historic plaque, and you'll see it there. And I'm reading this thing, and in the last line it says, it was here in 1858 that the famous Wanderer trial was held. I almost fell over it. They held it at the customs house, not at the federal courthouse. And by the way, that's one of the few plaques in all of Savannah that mention. I think it might be the only one that mentions the Wanderer, but, you know, which is, they ought to put up a few more, I suppose. But so anyhow, that's what that sort of poetic license did. It gave me a little more latitude, and since then, you know, I've been going to a lot of literary nonfiction conferences and speaking at them as well, and I could see that this question of how much literary license can you put into history is a very hot topic, and there's some people who are completely unethical about it, and you know, some people have said that Truman Capote in Cold Blood, you know, sort of fabricated some things. neat essay, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which I thought was a great book until I found out that a lot of it was not nonfiction. And there are a number of books like that. So it's the ethics of the thing is really a question. By the way, the second to last chapter in the book, I decided that what I needed to do was do one of these things of where are they now, or what happened to them all, because there were all these characters, and it was really hard but really interesting to try to track down the demise of these people. And I found that Corey, for instance, I was up in Charleston and I found the death certificate for Corey, the guy who had actually bought the ship, and it turned out that despite all of his radical spouting, he never served in the army or anything, but became a real first-class alcoholic. And then I found indications that every year he'd moved from one hotel to another, and he finally died at the Mills House in Charleston of alcoholism. Another one which was interesting was this guy Spratt, who I sort of bring out as the leading fire eater, and he was this really charismatic guy. And he ended up retiring to, of all places, Jacksonville, Florida. And then I went down to Jacksonville and I found in the records, exactly where he was in this one room with the shades always drawn. But what was really amazing was that Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had written Uncle Tom's Cabin, also retired to Jacksonville and lived just a few blocks away. So it was interesting. Just to wrap up, I know there was questions to, what did I really find that was earth-shaking to me and surprising and interesting. And I've got to say that, I grew up on Long Island, went to school in the north, and so as I recall, we were sort of taught, not explicitly, but implicitly, that, the war was, the North basically, it was a war against slavery, and the North, of course, had this great moral force against this great Southern immoral force, and the North fortunately won. And one of the real surprising parts of this journey for me was to find out that in 1858, the city that was the center of the African slave trade in America, wasn't in the South, it was New York City. And I've talked to people in New York, I've given some lectures and talks in New York City, and people's mouths just fall open. At one time I was at, I think it was called Pier 5, it's in Lower Manhattan, and it's a big complex, and they have, they have shops and all of that, but they have museums, and they have a place where I spoke. And it's running right out in front of this place is Pearl Street. And when I told these people that the center of this, I said, where is the center of the slave trade? And they say New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah. I said, no, it happened to be right here. And not only that, Pearl Street was where all the slave traders and the captains and all of these people had their offices. It sort of blew their minds. So that was one real epiphany for me. Another one was that I didn't realize that the fire eaters in the South had an agenda that was far different than just a civil war. They basically thought that the separation between North and South would probably be fairly easy. They could just beat their chests enough and people would allow it. But their dream, was for the Southern Empire, Republic, and would include Mexico and Nicaragua, Central America, Cuba. But beyond that, they expected a civil war in the South. That's what they want. They wanted an easy secession, as I understand it, from the North, and then they wanted a civil war in the South, where a democracy. They didn't want a democracy. They wanted a republic. They wanted to be in the ruling class of this new empire. So that was also something that I found very interesting.